All right, well, I'm now here with total stranger Bhaskar Sunkara. You, of course, know him as the author of the Socialist Manifesto, and he is the new president of the nation. Obviously, here at Jacobin, we don't know him at all. Bhaskar, it's good to see you.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I've only had to, ask 5 times to be on, but I was, so glad that you guys finally agreed to have me on.
Yeah, we caved into Boscar's begging. We finally decided to bring him back. No, actually, Boscar, the reason why we wanted to talk to you today is number one, you had a recent interview in the New York Times with Ezra Klein where you sort of talk about kind of the state that the left is in right now, right? And the impetus for that conversation was not Jacobin's recent issue, but the issue that came out before, which is called The Left in Purgatory. We covered that a little bit on the show, and I think that there are some sort of interesting themes that we can talk about today. But the second piece is that our friend Bronco, of course, had a piece in Jacobin recently. Arguing that Bernie Sanders should run again, right? And I feel like I recently saw Bernie sort of come out and say, like, if Biden runs in 2024, I'm not going to run. So again, I think he's kind of put the lid on that. But it did get me started thinking about how something that I think is sort of dispiriting about the left right now is that Bernie Sanders really has no successor, right? At least that's what I think. And so I thought maybe like we could have you on today to talk about that. Do you think Bernie Sanders has a successor? I know that, people have sort of floated this idea of like obviously AOC as a successor. I think I saw an article where like some progressive groups are trying to put forth Ro Khanna as a Bernie successor. And, I like those politicians and I like a number of other sort of left or like democratic socialist aligned politicians at the local and state level. But like I said, I still feel like Bernie Sanders has no successor. So what are your thoughts on that? Why doesn't Bernie Sanders have a successor? And like, what would a good Bernie Sanders successor even look like?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders just emerged in such a unique situation. I mean, he was someone who came out of the old left. He identifies as a socialist since he was, a student at the University of Chicago. He drew on a much older left-wing tradition. He was involved in trade union work and the civil rights movement and so on. And obviously, he was a quirky guy. I'm not saying that he had his ready for the masses message all together in the 1970s when he was basically a back to the lander in Vermont and involved obviously in important solidarity work, but very much was like in a man of the new left in many ways. But by the time the 80s came around, you had Bernie as a politician who learned how to win over voters and to organize people with a clear, straightforward message. And he that was tied to his socialist identification, but the most important part wasn't his ideological checklist. It was his method of politics, which was a class struggle oriented mode of politics. He would create a polarization and talk about millionaires and billionaires standing in the way of progress. And I think that with some politicians like AOC, you get some bad tendencies that I also saw in the Bernie campaign, particularly in 2020, which was just turning politics into a laundry list of stuff we want, like a policy wish list, instead of narrowing down the focus of to your strongest points and what you want the election to be about. So, Bernie was talking about Medicare for all and lowering drug prices. If the election was fought on that basis, Bernie would have an upper hand, but instead we extended the scope of things to encompass lots of other things we care about too, like student loans or free internet or whatever else, and a host of things that I think a left-wing administration would bring into being. But your rhetoric kind of needs to have that repetition, and that was a strength of Bernie. I think AOC falls sometimes in the laundry list type of politics, and also I think sometimes her rhetoric is much more academic. So instead of just talking about one type of exploitation in a broad term that can encompass a lot of people, we're talking about there's like the multiplicities of different things. She's always trying to like complicate things. saying, oh, it's good that you're concerned about this, but you should also be concerned about this and how these two things relate to each other. Which again, I'm not opposed to necessarily at an intellectual level, but fundamentally with politics, we need a simple, common sense class struggle narrative. And I think Bernie was much closer to that. And then on the policy end, I think Ro Khanna actually is a little bit better, for example, just because you brought him up. I think he's much better at narrowing down the focus of things and becoming the representative who cares about trade policy and cares about working class economics and a host of other stuff, which to his credit is impressive because he's in California District 17, a very deep blue district, so he doesn't really have to do this. But I think that is a better rhetoric and a better focus for more contested working class districts. But he constantly is identifying as a progressive capitalist, which is kind of like meaningless, and it kind of gets to the point of like wonkishness, and he doesn't have that focus on antagonism. So there's not enough of the Bernie style. We're getting looted by some people, and here are their names, and they're millionaires and billionaires profiting off your situation. It's much more diffuse, and I think that's a problem that at our best AOC doesn't have. But we're dealing with a bunch of alternatives who, again, are better than your average American politician, but don't seem to have that combination that Bernie had.
I want to ask a kind of related question now, which is I feel like, during the 2016 and 2020 Bernie Sanders campaigns, there was kind of a segment of the left, or at least a segment of progressives, that would say things like, well, I like Bernie, but like the future of the left doesn't look like Bernie Sanders. So the future of the left isn't Bernie Sanders. It's someone like AOC. And the implication here being that like a young woman of color who kind of speaks more of this like social justice language is more of the future of the left. Or people would say like, well, like the future of the left isn't Bernie Sanders. It's something like Black Lives Matter, right? So like not a politician or like not a single person, but kind of like a broader movement, which again is more situated in something like racial justice. What do you make of that claim? I mean, I have some thoughts. I have some thoughts about it, but you go first.
Well, I think to start with, AOC and Bernie Sanders, in my mind, have the same background. They're both children of immigrants. They are both born in New York City, but upwardly mobile, then get a chance to go to an elite school and is in this kind of liminal space in between, kind of more working class roots, then obviously kind of the chance and upward ascent. They both obviously choose to identify with the political left and become ambassadors of the political left. So I actually think that, especially if you consider their backgrounds are not all that different to begin with. Now, I think that the goal of a left is to build a majority behind the type of transformation that we want in the United States. So we want to build a left that can organize people at their workplaces, that can elect candidates, that can push to make America a more egalitarian place. And I don't think that there's a segment of the population we could afford to ignore. I don't think we could write off potential leaders because they're white males, nor do I think that we should necessarily avoid criticizing and pushing our representatives of the left who aren't white males. So I think that there's a fine line, because with AOC, I think a lot of criticisms can become very hyperbolic and very personalized in a way that I think is quite unfair. But on the other hand, she has this kind of historic responsibility. America, not by our own choice, but just because of the dynamics of capitalism and imperialism, is the most important country, at the moment at least, on earth. And if we think that the left is important and the left has an historic mission, then our most widely known non-Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist in America, AOC, has a almost a world historic role. So so there's some sort of I think middle ground between criticizing her for like fairly banal like Instagram stories. Like
Yeah.
sometimes the criticisms are worthy, but other times it's just like, yeah, it's just like a 32-year-old with an Instagram is gonna, it's there's nothing really like there
Yeah.
to attack. But on the other hand, I think when it comes to her rhetoric, at her best, she was really like soaring, and she was
Hmm.
invoking almost like a sort of New Deal like populism mixed with an identification as a socialist, and
Hmm.
just seemed to really capture something. And then I think she's her own worst enemy at other times, and she's
Yeah.
invoking like hyper academic, specialized rhetoric where it's not clear that she has like a grasp of what she actually wants to say and what her intervention
Yeah.
should be. And it often reminds me of, the difference between when you kind of know what you want to say, but you haven't really like thought through it fully, and then you are halfway through saying it, like this interview, for instance, and then you're just caught in this, vague space in between. I think like a lot of
Hmm.
her talking about policy is that, whereas Bernie is by no means like a policy expert on a lot of
Hmm.
things. He's not known
Yeah.
for that, but he just kept it simple to first
Yeah.
principles, then he would let other people down the road and his staff complicate it.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't complicate it himself.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to something that you alluded to earlier, Bernie was just like the master of the pivot. And I think the classic example is, when he sat down for an interview with Maureen Dowd, I believe
Mm-hmm.
last year, he just whipped out a list of things that he wanted to talk about. And Maureen kept trying to like bring up Dua Lipa or like, things that were outside the scope of the list. And he would just hold it up and wave it at her. Like, I think that that is so classically Bernie, and something that's sort of related, which I think is also something that you're getting at, when contrasting AOC and Bernie, is, at least for me, I felt like Bernie did a kind of incredible job of consistently leaning away from culture wars. And by that I mean, let's take a kind of like hot button like rhetorical issue that people have been discussing, which is the use or lack thereof of a term like Latinx, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, something I remember about the Bernie campaign is in 2020, and I believe in 2016, they were specifically like, we're not going to use this term. It's like, again, it's very academic and kind of NGO. Like, lots of Latino people who are surveyed say that they don't know about it or they don't like it. So we're just going to call Latinos Latinos. That was a specific strategic messaging decision the campaign made. But obviously, Bernie Sanders isn't a culture warrior like Marco Rubio, or, I don't know, name X Republican or even some Democrats who are like going on Twitter and complaining about the term Latinx. He's just like, this isn't a part of my campaign and I have no further comment, right? Uh, by contrast, AOC, I think recently like started a little bit of like an internet flurry again when she sort of ostentatiously was like, well, here's why I use the term Latinx, and I'm specifically, juxtaposing myself with the Democratic politicians who say that they don't want to use it. You see what I'm getting at here? Like, it's just
Yeah.
it's not that Bernie was like ostentatiously anti woke or anything like that, but I feel like the difference is that he sort of leaned away from the culture war, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, to some extent, AOC's whole exchange showed her at her best and her worst, right? Which is that she was pushing back against the culture war, in one instance by saying that, if you actually like care about these issues of jobs
Hmm.
and education, and you care about these communities, and like, the label doesn't matter why you're focusing on the label. That was part of
Right.
it. Then there was kind of the affirmation of the label itself. But I
Right.
think there was kind of the two souls of AOC there. But yeah, fundamentally, I think on a lot of these issues, we want to pivot from the culture war as much as
Hmm.
possible, right? We want to pivot to just common sense, bread and butter issues. And then obviously, part of our premise is that if you have a broad based working class left and a working class movement in the United States fighting for political ends, it will just look, quote unquote, a lot more normie just by virtue of there being more people involved. Obviously, there's
Yeah.
an counter to that argument, which is just that, in certain instances, could our rhetoric be a barrier towards building that coalition to begin with?
Right.
I'm not sure it is right now. I think even with the term Latinx, I actually don't think there's a very large constituency, even on the left, defending it. But I think that
Yeah.
it's useful as a shorthand because it kind of It's useful because the type of push behind Latinx that was there for a little bit is emblematic of other pushes that are just
Right.
purely about rhetoric and about
Yeah.
convincing people to use more inclusive language. And you're spending all this capital, and all these like NGOs or even activist organizations in the left are spending times internally policing language instead of outwardly trying to build this kind of coalition. And for the record, I think Hispanic is a lot more inclusive because it uses a lot more. Hispanic people in the U.S. use that identification to begin with,
Right.
compared to even
Yeah.
Latino. But I do think that's a perfectly illustrative example of the difference between the two. But also, I would hesitate to completely write off AOC in part because she has this, I think, this other part to her politics that we need to have her, come out with. And
Yeah.
again, AOC is not a candidate for office that is not yet elected. She's already elected, if that
Right.
makes sense. And
Yeah.
at a certain point, because she was a part of this wave, because she identifies as a democratic socialist, her identification as a democratic socialist is stronger than any of our individual identifications as a democratic socialist. So if
Right.
she's open
Right.
to being transformed on some of these points or pushed on some of these points, then I think we kind of have to, the old
Yeah.
expression, like dance with the one who brung you.
Yeah, okay, so my next question isn't really about like AOC proper, but something I was thinking of is Natalie Shore came on the show a while ago, obviously when the Left in Purgatory issue came out to talk about her article on AOC. And we got started talking about this like very specific type of liberal that was like, I hate Bernie Sanders. I cannot stand him. Like, no more old white men, but I love AOC. I don't know how like widespread this type of person is. I suspect that they're sort of limited to like liberal think tanks on the coasts. But something I asked Natalie, which I'm now going to pose to you, is like, do you think that that kind of aspect of AOC or of a politician like AOC, of kind of like, you know, not necessarily consciously, but nevertheless sort of courting or like appealing to a kind of segment of the liberal electorate is useful in any way? I mean, I'll just go ahead and say Natalie and I were both like, I think that that has diminishing returns, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in low turnout Democratic Party primaries, that actually actively pissing off certain liberals might not be a good thing. But
Yeah.
our main goal is kind of otherwise. Our main goal is to organize working class people around a broadly economic platform that ties in social issues into core, the primary contradiction, if you want to put it in those terms, of core economic issues. And obviously, to the extent that certain liberal groups stand in our way, then we'll have to, criticize and figure out ways to kind of take them head on. In other
Yeah.
cases, it might be a lot more contradictory. Like you could run a race, progressive race, and you might find that like the local Sierra Club is fine. Where in the abstract, the Sierra Club is terrible. At the national level, they're pretty terrible too. So it might be that a lot of people, even who are member activists of some of these fairly decrepit liberal organizations, are persuadable because
Yeah.
maybe that was the only game in town when they entered
Hmm.
politics 7, 8 years ago. Maybe they are just broadly progressive and this was their outlet and they're in a red district and, liberal groups took on a different, spirit there.
Yeah.
So I do think that we want to again have candidates that focus not on just a list of policy preferences, just not on like
Hmm.
a recipe list
Right.
of things we want, but candidates that focus on class and focus on
Yeah.
class antagonism, because
Hmm.
it's a lot different to have a candidate who says, I'm worried about the trade deficit because American businesses are less competitive and we all need to band together. And the candidate that says that like we're having our jobs outshored because we're not investing enough and we need to take on the establishment and entrenched
Yeah.
power who are standing in our way. Like on the face of it, they might come to similar short-term policy conclusions, but there's a huge difference in the movement and type of politics we're trying to build. And
Right.
again, sometimes that overlaps with these cultural divides of parts of the
Right.
left that want to focus on bread and butter issues versus like want to talk more about race as racism as kind of a freestanding system. But aside from that, there's also this cleavage between people who center left politicians who want to talk about economic policy in a certain way versus
Right.
the Bernie type politicians who talk about it in a different way. And I think we need to have the toolkit for our politicians so they know both the rhetoric and how to talk about policies without it becoming a like Elizabeth Warren style progressivism,
Right.
and also not become like this weird like linguistic
Yeah.
somersaults.
So I guess that kind of leads to this broader question, which is something that you got into when you were talking with Ezra Klein, and that's the class composition of the left, right? Like you talked with Ezra about that at length. We have talked about it at length on this show, and so basically, like everybody who's watching, I think, is sort of familiar with the problem that the left, since the 60s and 70s, has tended to become more professional, managerial class or middle class, and has sort of lost its working class base. Uh, that said, what do you think is the biggest obstacle right now for the left when it comes to developing or like building or like getting back a working class base? Is it kind of these cultural and rhetorical and linguistic ticks that we've been talking about, or is there something else?
Well, I think our rhetoric on the left is wrong, but our rhetoric is a product of defeat.
Yeah,
So I think
right.
that past defeats have inherited us a starting point for organizing this country, which is like almost nil. And also, it's left us cloistered in the ghetto of the left. And some of us have we're in small socialist groups that had our own particular language and quirks. Like I come out of the American socialist movement far from being a mass force in society, one that could tell you exactly what year the Russian Revolution degenerated into Stalinism, and whether the USSR was a bureaucratic collectivist country or a state capitalist country or somewhere in between. But the question is really, is that the primary barrier? No, not necessarily, but it is the thing that we can most easily fix.
Right.
So both in my like analysis, I think that we're dealing with the weight of history and the weight of past defeats. But the reason why I emphasize rhetoric so much is because I think that's something that our candidates can really learn from, and we already kind of know the secret of running more competitive races. Even when we lose, we could still get closer if we realize that working class voters prefer candidates who focus primarily on economic issues. They're not
Yeah.
opposed to any mentions of racism. They're fine with mentions of racism, but they want those bread and butter issues to be framed in universal terms. So
Yeah.
healthcare is good because healthcare is good, not because healthcare is a racial justice issue.
Right.
And I think they also, in general, don't want candidates who are, working at hedge funds or trial
Yeah.
lawyers or whatever else. I think there's a strong preference towards working class, you know, professions. And
Right.
again, there's a host of just things that we can do to make sure that even if we are reliant on an activist base to begin with, we're not just stuck with this base forever. And this
Yeah.
base evolves and joins, like emerges with, if you want to put it that way, the working class as a whole. Because if you look at a lot of these groups, like look around at groups you might be a member of, maybe an environmentalist group, maybe it's a socialist group, whatever else, and just ask yourself, is this group equipped, prepared, and doesn't even want to have an influx of 5, 6, 7,000 working class people to join it tomorrow?
Right. Right.
Because at the very least, we should be building the shells of organizations that become mass organizations in the future. We shouldn't be building groups that are so sensitive that a few interpersonal things or a few, controversies, totally gets it destroyed, or they spend so long just inwardly debating with each other and then deciding when
Yeah.
the next meeting is, instead of outwardly kind of in action, doing
Right.
things. And I think at our best, the Democratic Socialists of America is a group that runs candidates and campaigns, supports labor drives, and does a host of things that are really productive. At our worst, we're a group that's very inwardly focused. So I think there's certain groups that are kind of like on the cusp of both, and we just have to hope that the best tendencies win.
All right, so I want to wrap up on a slightly optimistic note here, and somebody sent me this tweet a while ago, and we're gonna throw it up on screen. I'll read it. Somebody tweeted last year, speaking as someone who occasionally stuck my toe into the world of socialist politics pre 2015, it's hard to overstate just how off-putting and alienating a ton of it was. So obviously pre Bernie, and then this person goes on to say, like, for all the things there are to complain about now, we don't regularly have people interrupt events to yell about how the SPD killed Rosa Luxemburg. And then the kicker is they then write, a favorite memory is Bhaskar Sunkara interrupting one of them back and admitting to doing it personally. So, Bhaskar, you're on record as having killed Rosa Luxemburg, apparently. But do you agree with the overall
Yeah.
assessment that the left, even as kind of sort of gloomy as things seem now, is still in a better place than it was pre-Bernie?
Hey, listen, I would have been on Rosa Luxemburg's side because Weimar didn't end very well. I feel like any sort of form of socialism would have worked better than the Weimar Republic did. But yeah, I mean, I think that Bernie Sanders is responsible for us having this taste of power, this
Hmm.
taste of at least thinking seriously about what it would mean to have a left winger in the White House. But that was always meant to be just phase one of a multi phase plan, right? So the logic was our roads to building and organizing a left were totally blocked. We were completely weak and disoriented. We would try to run a competitive campaign, maybe even get someone in the White House. And from there, that person could help create, through the bully pulpit of the White House and through the bully pulpit of the campaign, even before that, the conditions in which we could repoliticize parts of American life that were totally unpoliticized. But ironically, I feel like, one, we failed in our attempt. We were able to rejuvenate parts of the left. Well, we seem to be repoliticizing some parts of life that don't need to be politicized. And we seem to have left a lot of workplaces and a lot of day-to-day concerns of poor and working class people, which are largely economic concerns, in the rearview mirror. And I think it's really important for people just to remember that one core message can just about work for everyone. If you look at the
Yeah.
voting patterns of white workers, Latino workers, black workers, Asian voters, they're all more or less the same. People
Yeah.
care about healthcare, they care about jobs, they care about a host of the same issues. Now, when you want to reach people, when you want to transmit your ideas, that's where I'm very open to particularly, culturalist ways of organizing. If you find that they're effective, it
Hmm.
might be that if you want to win over black voters in a Democratic primary, you have to be more sensitive to the black church. You have to be more
Hmm.
sensitive to certain organizations and civic organizations if you're in an Asian, working class area. So obviously there's tactics involved. It's not just a matter of like saying, I'm going to say the same five class reductionist things over and over again. There needs to
Right.
be some sort of creativity. I think Bernie actually did
Yeah.
that with his, talk to your TO kind of, campaign with
Hmm.
Hispanic voters. That was quite effective. So
Hmm.
I'm all for a new wave of creativity in how we make these approaches. But I do think we kind of need to keep
I
it
agree, but
simple.
I would also say that the like worst case scenario of that is Hillary Clinton is your abuela. Remember that?
Yes, yeah, but I actually, yes, that was kind of corny, but I did really respect Hillary Clinton because she kept hot sauce in her bag, and I think
Right,
that,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think that won her at least a few voters.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
My
All
mom's
right.
Trinidadian. She actually keeps pepper sauce in her bag, so
And
it's
obviously
a
voted for
thing.
Hillary Clinton.
She did she vote for Hillary Clinton? No, she was a firm
Bernie
Bernie
bro.
voters. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, like a lot of working class people, I think I think my mother was, who's working class Democrats, I should say, are very much pro Democratic Party. So she's like, oh, look at all these wonderful, nice people. So she liked Bernie, she liked Hillary, she
Yeah.
likes Biden, and I think again that's a much more common thing out there in the wild, and we need to relate to
Yeah.
than on Twitter.
Fair enough. All right. Well, Bhaskar, good to see you as always. Thanks again, and we'll get you back soon.
All right, great, thanks for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.